So I went looking for a story to tell. I had only produced shorts for the nonprofit sector, and my passion has always been documentary films. So I had a little story file full of about 5 different stories from all over the world. And I found this story in Mother Jones magazine about Eloise Cobell from the Blackfeet tribe and her lawsuit against the United States government, which is the largest lawsuit in the history of the government. And I thought I was reading it wrong. I thought, how could this be going on today? This is probably something from the 19th century. And so I was baffled when I read on and realized this is going on right now, and that there are Native American people, 300,000 families who are living on reservations with mineral-rich lands, and they have oil wells pumping 24/7, and they are living without the basic necessities of life because they don't get paid what they were rightfully owed for their land. And so when I read that, I was incensed. I was just outraged by the injustice. But I had a little problem. I'm a non-Native person, and I had never set foot on a reservation, and I didn't know any Native people. So it was, where do I go? So I immediately called Eloise's office, Eloise Cobell, and tried to get her on the phone, but I couldn't get past the gatekeeper. And she would just take messages from me, and then I'd send, film treatments, and I'd send, communications to no avail. And so I just decided that I was going to pursue other, people that were involved in the lawsuit. And I happened to be out in Colorado attending a wedding, and I called John Hawk from the Native American Rights Fund, and I asked him if I could spend some time with him, and told him I was interested in telling a documentary film, telling the story through a film. And so I met with him, not knowing how long he would give me. He was the executive director of one of the largest Native American organizations that, fought all the legal cases for the tribes in the country. So I went in, and I had never met him before, and I thought maybe he'll give me a half an hour. So unlike Eloise, he was extremely happy to see me because nobody was covering this story. The press wasn't covering it. It was like if it made it into the newspapers, it was a tiny, tiny little article, but mainly it wasn't reported on. So he was thrilled that I wanted to cover this story. And so John Hawk has become a mentor of mine, and he mentored me for 14 years through the whole process. And then by the time, Eloise came around, and I followed her all over the country from meeting to meeting to meeting, hoping that she would just, have time to talk to me. And finally at one meeting she said, oh, you're that fire in the belly lady, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And she goes, do you think we can meet in a couple hours? I have a really packed schedule. And I was like, sure. So I waited, and of course that didn't happen. And then at the end of the day, she said, I'm really sorry I couldn't get to you, but how about if you fly out to the Blackfeet tribe in Montana? And I had been just dreaming of that. That's all I wanted to do. And so that's how it started. So I went out there for my first meeting with her, and she took me to a sacred burial site where 500 Blackfeet Indians who starved to death because they didn't get the food rations from the Indian agent in this winter of, I think it was 1896. So one by one, they starved to death, and they poured them in this mass grave. And that was a very, very difficult time for the Native people, for the Blackfeet people. And it was very difficult for her to be there standing on the hallowed ground explaining to me, and I felt the intense pain from her. And so that's basically how I started on this journey, and I did tons and tons of research because I was not only taking on the United States government, the Department of the Interior, and the Department of Treasury were being sued by Eloise Cobell and the Native American Rights Fund. and that was John Echohawk's organization. So it was a very, very big case, and I just racked my brain out thinking, how am I going to tell this story? I mean, this is a legal story. How am I going to make this interesting? And of course, the only way was to tell Eloise's story, which was, she's a hero, and she was one of those, women that she was unstoppable. And she had I called it her mantra. She would say to me, she must have said it to me over the years 100 times, Melinda, I know the stars are aligned for justice. And I know that Indian people will get justice someday. The stars are aligned. And every time she said it, I believed her.
So what year was this?
She filed the lawsuit in 1996. I came on the scene in 2002.
Okay, so the lawsuit was filed. When was the conclusion? And you said the largest settlement in U.S. government history. How much was it for?
$3.4 billion.
With a B.
With a B.
Wow.
And that sounds like a lot of money, but the estimates for how much money the Indians were bilked by the U.S. government was $176 billion with a B.
So explain that. So there's Native American land. Obviously, these are the reservations. I grew up in a town called Puyallup, which is a Native American reservation. So we're very familiar with that. But explain that and explain why the settlement came to pass due to the land rights and the minerals and oil and all that stuff.
So basically, through the Dawes Act, Senator Dawes was trying to help, this country assimilate the Indians into our culture. So what he proposed was an Allotment Act. And what that meant was that they would basically put the Indians on reservations, and they would give Indian families their own parcels of land. But the government didn't think the Indians were smart enough to be able to manage that land. So they said, we will manage it for you. So they put all of the royalty payments into a trust fund, the Indian Trust Fund. And over the course of 100 years, which is why the movie is titled 100 Years, this is what happened is, the Indian people would never get reports on how much oil was taken out of their land or what grade of oil, and sometimes they would get statements that showed there was $6,000 worth of oil taken out of their land, but the particular Indian only got $89 out of it. And sometimes it was even a minus 20 for parts for the oil company. It was absolutely ridiculous that they were responsible for. And so this was all managed through the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so what would happen is that on every reservation, there was a BIA office, Bureau of Indian Affairs office. And so the people would go in, and they'd stand in line, and they'd stand in line, and they'd wait, and they'd wait, and they'd wait, because they wanted to get answers on their land. Why am I not getting these checks? Why are the checks so small? And why is my landmass dwindling? So this went on for such a long time, and Eloise filed the lawsuit because, as she said, they were living without the bare necessities of life. We're not talking about people in mansions. We're talking about people that are living in, poverty-stricken lands, in trailers without running water or electricity. And in our film, we had one Navajo woman who she had to set up just to watch TV. She'd have to, run a line from the front porch, and and she had a gas line that was running through her land, but she couldn't get gas from that gas line to heat her home. So during the winter times, she would have to move because it got too cold for her to survive. So this was an everyday occurrence. And we heard story after story after story. The Indian agent won't give me my land, my money, my funds. and they won't give me the answers to what's happening to my funds. And so that's when Eloise just drew a line in the sand. She actually she was a speaker. She was at a speaking engagement for a bankers conference. She became a banker to learn how to read these statements. And she became the treasurer of her tribe so that she would know how this was supposed to work. And she could see that the oil companies were taking oil off the tribal lands and not putting it in, not paying it back. So then she started knocking on doors, calling her senators and congressmen, and she finally met with the Attorney General, Janet Reno, at this banking conference, and she said, "Oh, Attorney General, I've got to talk to you. There's this terrible problem with the Indian Trust Fund, and we must fix it." And she said, "Okay, Eloise," she says, "call my office and we'll set up a meeting." So she did. It took about a year, and she called every week, and she was persistent. And so she finally got in, and she went to this conference, and she was supposed to, she finally got in to meet with the DOJ and the Department of Interior, except they weren't there. It was a room full of attorneys. And when Eloise walked in, one of the attorneys said to her, "Now, Eloise, don't you come in here with any false expectations." And she said, "How dare you speak to me like that? There are people, Indian people, that are dying every day without the basic necessities of life." And that was the last straw for her. So she drew a line in the sand and she said, "I've had enough." And she filed the largest class action lawsuit in the history of the United States government. So it was a very long battle. It was a 15-year battle.
And the payout was when?
It was in 2000 when President Obama was elected, the first term. He had 5 offices in Indian reservations, and he said, "If I am elected, I will resolve this case. We will resolve it." And that was his promise, and he kept his promise. So he announced, as a matter of fact, 6 months after he was inaugurated, I thought, this is never going to happen, because that was during the financial collapse, in that era. Yeah. And so I thought, there's no way this is going to come to fruition. And then 6 months later, they were in talks with the plaintiff's attorneys. And then I think it was in December of 2009, he made an announcement that they had reached a settlement figure of $3.4 billion. And so, but then it had to be approved by Congress and also by the courts. So that's why what Eloise did was absolutely impossible, because she had to have all 3 executive levels of the United States government agree on the settlement, and they did. But it took almost 2 years before Congress and the courts agreed upon it and passed it, and it was done.
That's incredible. What is it about Eloise that, you spent so much time with her, you observed her life and her drive, and I can't imagine this was easy. Obviously something she dedicated her life to. I'm sure it was dangerous. Anytime you deal with mass wealth like that and taking on oil companies, I just can't imagine. What do you feel was her driving force in all of this?
I really, truly believe that her driving force was the event that I told you about earlier, which was the Ghost Ridge. They called it Ghost Ridge, and that was the sacred burial site. Eloise she had an office on the reservation, and every day she went to work, she would drive by that burial site. And there were days during the lawsuit, and there were a lot of tough days. When they removed the judge who was ruling in the Indians' favor. There were amazing challenges for her legally. And there were days when she was just so tired of the fight, and she would go to Ghost Ridge and she would pray to the people and say, "We're going to get them. We're going to get them for you." And every time they had a victory, like there were 2 secretaries of the Interior that were held in contempt of court. That every time they got a victory like that, she would go out and she would talk to the people and she'd pray to them and say, "We got them this time for you." So it was a very long, arduous process for her, and it took its toll on her life.
And is she still alive?
She died 4 months after the settlement was announced.
Let me ask you, I mean, normally you're a filmmaker, and so you're kind of part of what we do here at Nations as storytellers. And one thing that drives us is to make available the information that we care so deeply about. And I want to hear about your personal journey with this. Like, what was the spiritual toll? What was that advocacy moment? You're like, I'm going to dedicate my life to this cause, and it's something that I'm willing to give. I mean, you've been working on this 20 years now.
Well, I worked on that project 14 years, but then when you count the 2 or 3 years on top of that with being on the film circuit, promoting it, and now it's being taught in the schools, and it's been on Netflix and PBS, which is amazing. Yeah. So it's been a very long journey for me as well. Yes, it's been a challenge, and you talk about spiritual battle. One in particular was that my husband and I were driving back we had a house in Breckenridge, and we were driving back to the airport, and I felt, I had a stomach ache, and I said, "Can you please stop and let's get some ginger ale?" So we got off the highway going back to the airport. We were going back to San Diego, and it was the wintertime, and we hit black ice going off this ramp. And we were going at about 60 miles an hour on black ice, and there was no way to stop. And my husband could see that we were going to have to go through a stop sign, and he was going to try to go up the ramp on the other side. But instead, there was a truck coming from one side, and I believe a van or a Jeep from the other side, and they hit us, full impact. We got T-boned at 60 miles an hour. And immediately the airbags deployed, smoke came up. I thought the car was on fire. My life flashed before my eyes. My husband, when we came to a halt, he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, get out of the car." So we both got out, and then we had people coming to help us. The car was wrecked. It was, thank God, it was a Volvo, and it was a rental.
Safest cars on the road.
Yes, and there you go. There's a good advertisement for them. But I get chills when I talk about it, because we were on the way to the airport. The tow truck driver came and got us, and he looked at me and he said, because we had no cuts, bruises, no injuries at all.
Unreal.
And my husband got a little burn from the airbag, but I was sitting in the middle seat, and the truck driver looked at me and he said, "Did you have those glasses on when you hit?" And I went, "What glasses?" Oh my gosh. They never left my face. I had no bruising, no cuts, nothing. Well, then when we got to the airport, it was late at night, so we had missed our flight. They had put us on a Frontier flight, and we were walking down the concourse, and there was maybe 5 people. And my husband said to me, "Do you hear that?" I said, "Hear what?" "Listen to the music in the PA." And I listened, and it was Native American chanting music. I had never heard that playing in any airport. And my husband said, "I think you have a lot of work to do." And I told Eloise about our accident. And I didn't tell her the part about hearing the native. She just wanted to know if we were okay. And I told her, yes, we were. And we were very lucky. And then she invited me out to meet her for the first time. And before I got ready to leave, she said, how's your husband doing? I said, well, he's fine. Why? And she goes, well, you know, that horrible accident that you had 2 weeks after you met me, don't you think that was strange? I said, you have no idea how strange it was. And I told her what happened. And she was ready to pack up her stuff and say goodbye. She didn't have time to meet with me the next day, and it was a weekend. And I was fine with that, but I was disappointed, of course. As soon as she asked me about the details of the accident, she got up out of her chair, went over to the wall, and pointed at a Howard Turpning painting of Chief George Kicking Woman, who was the keeper of the sacred medicine bow. And he was on the top of Chief Mountain. And she said, I am going to take you to meet him tomorrow. He's 93 years old. And so she got on the phone and called the family and said, I have someone I want you to meet with tomorrow. And the next day we went and we met with him. And we were there for 2 hours. And he was praying over us the whole time. And he was lighting the sweetgrass, and it was just chilling. It was chilling. And then she took me back out to Ghost Ridge again. And I said to her, Eloise, I know you have a lot of people that want to tell your story. Hollywood was after her story. And I said, no matter what happens, you have enriched my life, and I want to thank you for this time. That's how it started.
That's incredible. So here you are, a white Christian woman who's coming alongside a people who've been neglected in the most, famous Christian nation, it's unbelievable to me. And so here you are, a reformer. That's what we would consider you, someone who's willing to participate in the brokenness, right, to see about reconciliation, hope, salvation, and so you're making this film. You're around. It's a lot. You worked on that film for a long time, and then with the touring, what did you say, 15, 14 years?
Well, I worked on it 14 years, and then I toured on it for over 2.
Wow, so that's a long process. Documentaries are not easy to make.
No, they're not.
What came from it? What would you say, when you have to look back on your involvement, what have you seen come from your film? Obviously, the settlement took place, but what would you say are some of the biggest victories for making your film?
I have never been so blessed in my life. And that's what I want to get across to people, is that once you find your purpose, and when you listen and you really listen to the Lord and the Holy Spirit, you just have to go for it. Because I kind of liken what I did to this. What I did was so, who would have ever thunk it? A white girl, right? It was kind of like me going over to France and saying to the French people, you have a really good story about the French Revolution. Why didn't you let me tell it?
Right.
But it's not really, it's like, who does that? Yeah. Right? Well, I did that. But I did that only with the help of my higher power, of the Lord. And so when you have that, we think we can dream big, but we have no idea. The Lord's dreams for us when we are working to help others is 150-fold bigger than our own dreams. And I am proof positive of that.
It's incredible. So I want to hear more about the new project you're working on. I mean, this project, as monumental and massive as it was really the tip of the spear for you. You've really integrated into, do we call this, part of my ignorance, do we call them Native Americans, or are we still allowed to say Indians? I grew up, it was an Indian reservation. And
yes.
Now so
yes,
what's
can,
the politically
both.
Correct?
I think it goes back and forth. American Indians, Native Americans.
Sure.
So, it's been over the years, it's gone back and forth. Okay. So I call them, I'm a non-native, and they're Native Americans, and that's how I refer to them. And I think that's fine by them.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's good to know. So what's the new project, and where are you at with it?
The new project is, actually I stumbled across across this silent crisis, if you will, when I was on my tour of 100 years. And I discovered that there's this silent crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it is another story that is unbeknownst to most people. It's not one of those stories that's being on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's and the statistics are incredible. Native women are 10 times more likely to be killed, to be murdered, than any other group of women in the United States. The Alaska Native women are the hardest hit. 2 out of 3 Native women are sexually assaulted in their lifetimes. And when their mothers talk to the daughters about being sexually assaulted, it's not if you are sexually assaulted, it's when you are sexually assaulted. They're pretty horrific stories.
So I'm just baffled by that here in the United States, that's a reality. Because I know, here in Southern California, if a child goes missing, it's like we have an Amber Alert. Your phones are going off, like signs on the highway. I mean, it's a massive. The news is covering it. Why is this such a silent reality?
It's exactly what doesn't happen on an Indian reservation. There are no Amber Alerts. They're starting to get Amber Alerts. This is just new. But they don't have... Normally, when a family has a missing daughter, they would go to the tribal police to report her gone. And 9 times out of 10, they'll get the response from the tribal police, she's probably out drinking with her friends and is afraid to come home, or she's partying. If she's not back in, 5 days, come back. Well, 5 days is you got to go, you've got to get on it right is when it's happening. As we saw, I lived in Poway when Chelsea King went missing, and within a matter of hours, they had search teams on the ground. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had police. It was all over the news, and then I think it was like 5 days later, they found her body near the lake that she went running alone, and 2 days before that, they were able to arrest the guy who sexually assaulted her and murdered her because they had found her clothing and his DNA.
So why is there such a gap between justice for, anybody outside of Indian reservations as opposed to women who and girls who are on Indian reservations?
First of all, they don't have the funding. The tribal police do not have the funding, and that funding is supposed to come from the government. And when it comes to the treaties, that the treaty promises they were supposed to get, health care and housing and education. And what they get is kind of the leftovers of all that. And this is a perfect example of the leftovers because there's no Amber Alerts. There's no coverage like you just described. And so it's left to the Indian families to do their own searching for their missing loved ones. And so much time elapses by then that there's families that I have a good friend who's actually a co-producer on my new project, Patsy Whitefoot, and her sister Daisy went missing 30 years ago. 30 years ago. They've never found the body. They've found articles of clothing, but never the body. That family lives with this knowledge. They have memorialized her after her 10-year and then 30-year again. But that I met at a conference in Portland, one of the sisters, Patsy's sister, and one of the sister that was closest to Daisy, the one who disappeared. And I was introduced as the filmmaker who's doing this series on missing and murdered. And she just stared off into the distance. She was a blank stare. She never acknowledged me. She never looked up. I could feel her pain. And then her husband, who was standing right next to me, described to me how each family member handles it differently and how traumatic it was for this particular sister because she was the closest to her. And it's something that they live with day in and day out.
So there's no federal assistance, like the FBI. Are they limited to what they can do? I mean, local police departments. Is there a line of delineation to where
Yes,
they can't cross in?
It's called a jurisdictional maze, and it's purposely set up like that. I believe it's ongoing genocide, and so it's been going on for years. Let me just give you an example. In 1996, the Violence Against Women Act was passed. Okay, there was no clause in there to cover Native women, not at all. It wasn't until 2013 when they added a little clause in there that protected Native women from domestic violence, but not rape, not murder, but domestic violence. So that kind of says it all right there. There is no coverage for them. And I could tell you story after story after story of how you think this is happening in another country, not in the United States, but it's ongoing. And in 1978, one of the reasons it is so ongoing is that in 1978, the Supreme Court, in the Oliphant ruling, took away the tribal rights to prosecute a non-native who committed a crime on the reservation. The most important thing of a tribal sovereign nation is to protect their citizens. Right. And that was completely taken away from them in 1978 by the Supreme Court of this United States of America.
Meaning that any non-native person who commits a crime on native grounds cannot be prosecuted
for that crime.
How is that is just absolutely so backwards. I can't understand. I just can't fathom that.
So let me just break it down in a little scenario here for you. So let's say you go into a convenience store on a reservation, non-native, right? You want to buy some cigarettes, maybe some booze, some beer, maybe some candy. You can get all those things you want, and you can walk right out the door, and they can't do anything about it. They can make a little note and try to, get compensated later, but nothing happens. Nothing happens. It's the same with a Native woman's life. There's actually the dark web, where people like pedophiles and rapists, they know now that they can get away with murder and rape. And so it's become a hunting ground for Native women. And Native women, by the way, are sex trafficked also. They're the highest numbers of sex traffic in the country. And the reason is because they're so marketable. They can look Polynesian, they can look, Native, they can look Asian, and they're very highly marketable. So it's a very vicious cycle, and it has a lot of ugly tentacles. And we want to expose through this film, this series, all the way back to the history of how this began. Because you see, Native women were considered sacred. They were matriarchal societies, and actually, when the men went into war, they always counseled with the women. They always, met with the women, and they have a saying, and one of the tribes has a saying that the woman owns all of her rights, and what she say be the law. So this rape and this, telling your daughter when you're raped, not if you're raped, this is completely foreign. Never happened in the early days. Pocahontas was the first abducted Native woman. So our goal is to go back, unlike, there's a lot of single documentaries about this issue, and there's a lot of really good ones. But what we want to do is we want to open it up. We want to do a 6-part series that goes into that 500 years of violence and how it started. And ultimately, we want to have a campaign, a social media campaign and a lobbying campaign to reverse the Oliphant decision.
So that's the goal here.
That's the goal.
And wow, I love it. And I love that you're right in the mix going for it, because that's how justice happens. Like, people have to be aware of it. It's incredible to me that I'm learning this for the first time, and I'm so thankful for you, and I'm so thankful for the article coming out in the journal, the Nation's Journal, and I just think that missionally, the gospel compels us to these places, and sometimes it's not normative missionally. It's like you're just in there telling the story and bringing about justice, and I hope and pray that it comes quickly. And tell me, do you have hard numbers on how many women are trafficked and murdered? And like I'm sure that'll come out in the documentary. But
we had, just for 1 year, and also on that note, I want to also make one other point. Native women are the only women in the United States that when they go missing, there's no federal accountability for them. Every other group of women, but not Native women. Okay, and that's what propelled me to do this film. I watched the movie Wind River, which is a dramatic film by Taylor Sheridan that is about a beautiful young Native woman who goes missing and she's killed, and she was dating someone from the man camps. And that's one of the biggest problems.
What are the man camps?
The man camps are like North Dakota. I was out at the MHA Nation, the three affiliated tribes. And they had a oil boom. I think it was back in probably 2010, maybe.
That's right. When they just needed laborers, and so these camps, these like cities of tents would be.
Yes, and they would bring these kids from, they would drop out of college because they'd make $100,000 a year working in the oil fields. So they have this, huge numbers of men. What do you do with them? And so they would bring the women in, and it was very scary. Yeah. And so I can't even imagine living on the reservation during these times.
This sounds like California state history, like the gold rush. This sounds so wild.
It's the same thing.
I thought it was like 10 years ago.
Yeah. So it's a pretty bad situation. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you're answering everything well. It's sparking so many more questions. This is wonderful. Just like hard numbers, like like, do we have any statistics? I mean, is there anybody keeping track of the data?
Well, this is the thing, because there is no federal accountability of missing Native women. It's the grassroots Native women who are doing the numbers. The National Crime Information Center in 2016 came out with a number of 5,700 Native women were missing that year.
5,700 women missing.
Native women in 2016, but only 2% of those names got entered into the NCIC.
That's unreal. So 5,600 people missing and never found, and no one's talking about it yet. And I don't want to make light of the situation when anybody else goes missing, because there needs to be Amber Alerts. It needs to be on the
Absolutely.
news. There need to be helicopters flying, and yet no one cares. And that's a lot of people.
It's staggering. And so there, Anita Lucchese, I believe her name is now, she's keeping her own database, and that's her life mission. Is to track these missing women. But, I've been out there for 3 years researching this project, this, issue, and I see they are the most resilient women I have ever met in my life. They have had to overcome such obstacles and fighting for the basic necessities, just getting back to Eloise's story, the basic necessities of life from their own land. And now this is fighting for their daughters and their granddaughters and their aunts and, and their mothers who go missing. These stories are heartbreaking. And the fact that there's so many good women out there that are doing the work to fight this injustice. I am just one little filmmaker, but there are women who are boots on the ground every single day. And, they work day and night. They're tired. I look at it and I see how little has been accomplished. Just like with this, the Violence Against Women Act. Now they're hoping to pass the revision under Biden, which would do more to protect the Native women, which I hope that they can. But we're still going for the big enchilada, which is, let's fix the Supreme Court ruling. This is wrong on so many levels. And just the explanation of, being able to drive into a convenience store on a reservation and just take whatever you want. People, when they hear that, they can't comprehend it. Right. But it's going on.
What I see you doing is, as a filmmaker, is you're building a bridge, and that's a big, important part of advocacy work. And you're making this narrative and this reality accessible by the mainstream, and that needs to happen. And so I'm just so grateful for you. When I was working on the documentary that I did in Iraq, I just remember, I'm meeting with women and girls who have been so abused by ISIS, and I just remember the rage would just come up occasionally, and I was just uncontrollably angry at the situation. How do you handle all of this? What are your spiritual rhythms and practices that keep you sane?
It's really a good question because I have actually been counseled that because of the work that I'm doing on this story, because the work that I did on 100 Years was tough, but this is a whole nother tough. And I think that God has given me the gift of mercy. And so with that gift, you have to be very careful. I realized this because just recently I became really emotionally involved in something that happened to a friend of mine. And I kind of felt like I was disassociating, And so I talked to my therapist, and she said, I'm so glad that this has happened right now because you are getting ready to go into this big venture, into this, big, series, and you're going to be hearing the stories. And I have heard the stories already, but I haven't heard the ones that I'm going to hear for the film. So that's going to be an ongoing process. And she told me that I really have to prepare myself and to try to get in touch with my senses. It's a sensory thing that you have to, once you start feeling that you're kind of disconnecting, that you have to, let's say you're in a room and I look at that picture over there and I look at the picture and I count all the colors that are in that photograph, or, how many leaves are on the tree if I'm outside. Something that can, bring me back to that place where I'm not so absorbed. Right. So, and in reading, I found myself in reading some of the articles that are so traumatic, in nation's media even. I found that it was hard for me to read on because I'm so affected emotionally by those, the ISIS, like you were talking about the ISIS and the way they absolutely rape and murder their children, and then show the mothers, their dead bodies. And so I'm very, very sensitive now, and I'm very protective of myself because, like I said, the work I did with 100 Years was difficult. There were times when we were filming on the Navajo reservation with, these people who had oil and gas lands, and they were living in these trailers that had holes in them. They had to move during the winter. They couldn't live there because they didn't have the means to live there. And this one woman she broke down and cried on camera. And after we finished shooting, I just excused myself from my crew, and I said, I just need to recompose myself. And I just felt her pain. And so this is going to be so much, different, so much more different, and so much more, the stories are heartbreaking. Yeah,
it's a dance, isn't it? Like I meet people who work in the field who are kind of callous to it. And, because they're in that world day in and day out. And I'm like, man, I never want to go there. I never want to be there. I want to be involved, but I don't want to be callous to it and like hard-hardened. And, but I want to have that, that soft skin towards, the hurt. I want to feel that pain. But then the other side's true where it cripples you. And I just remember like, oh my goodness. And so I really started looking at like the rhythm of Jesus, and he would constantly retreat and find rest,
constantly,
and seeking the Father on a daily, and then like paying attention to like the two invitations of Christ to come unto me and then come follow me. And oftentimes I'm so quick to just follow Jesus. I'm like, where are we going? The Great Commission. Right. And I had to learn that no, both go hand in hand. Like you have to come to Christ for that salvation, that rest, that healing, and before you're commissioned into something that you're doing. And it's so difficult. It's such a fine dance.
And I had that same realization this last, experience when I felt like this, and I prayed about it, and the Lord put on my heart, you don't know the plans I have for her. And I thought, wow, you're right. I am assuming the worst from the scenario that I was given. But I don't know what God has planned for her. And so that's when I realized I just needed to spend time with him and to just really trust in the direction that he was taking me, and to really listen like that, because it was almost like a scolding. It was almost like, well, I don't think you know the plans that I have for her, do you? And I went, no, it could be, I just went through a difficult time in my life, and things are working out now. And I think, it says in the Bible, we're supposed to rejoice during trials and tribulations, because we have no idea what God's full plan is. And so many times it's those very moments that we had that were traumatic and that were dark that forced us to get in touch with the Lord and what his will, because I would just, during this time, I would just go to bed every night saying, thy will be done, Lord, not mine, because I surrender. And so you're right. It is really and that's how you kind of, it's a calling, and that, and so I try not to worry about it. Because I know as long as I have that connection in that prayer life, that I will be okay. And when you asked me, what was the best thing about 100 years? And the best thing about 100 years for me was, the film won a lot of awards. That's great, but nothing compares to the fact that this film is being taught all around the world.
It's incredible. Colleges, Harvard.
It's being Harvard, Duke, Dartmouth, Berkeley, Stanford. It's being taught in public schools in 25 states in the United States. It's being taught in Canada and Taiwan and New Zealand and Australia. And that's what I was, referring to when I said, we can't dream as big as the Lord can. When I formed Fire in the Belly Productions, my production company, I formed it with the goal of making films that make a difference in the world. And at the time, I didn't even think about in the world. I just thought, okay, I'm just going to go big. Yeah. And then when you do that, well, lo and behold, the film's being shown around the world.
That's amazing. That is incredible. Well, it just goes to show that, like you're your courage and your faith and this journey has really just been what the Lord's asked of you. Like, put a camera on the situation and hit record and become an advocate. And so I guess my final question is, how can, I'm brand new to this reality. I've known there's been injustices, like I've known it. But how can someone like myself or the audience become more involved with seeking justice for the Native people in this specific crisis? Is there anything you would suggest? Can we follow your journey?
Yes.
Are there other things that we can do?
I have, a Twitter account, 100 years.
And that'll
also
be the same process for this new story.
So I will have a Twitter account for the new project too. We're currently our working title, if you will, is "Women Are Sacred, Missing and Murdered." But I don't know if that will be our final title, but that's what our website is, and we're just getting ready to launch the website, and so yes, it would be through Twitter, and also I'm really excited about forming the social impact campaign and a lobbying campaign. So I don't have the particulars on that right now because it's all really in development. It's really early stages, but I will definitely stay in touch with you so you can get that information to your audience.
Well, and one of our values at Nations is that we don't just tell the story and let it be. Like, we want to be in relationship with you for forever, and we believe this story will continue, and so we want to continue to report on it, and we're excited that you're an access point for us into this, and so you've already introduced us to Huron, and so there's going to be more stories of what more reformers working amongst the Native people, and it's just so exciting for us. And so, Melinda, I can't thank you enough for your advocacy work, your filmmaking ability, and just your reformer spirit. You're an amazing individual, and I'm so glad to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be on the podcast because, I didn't know about Nations Media until I was introduced through Todd. And I was so excited when you kept saying, we're like the Christian Nat Geo. And I'm like, wow, that's a pretty big statement. So I want to see this Nat Geo. And I love the look of your magazines. They are first-class quality. So I want to commend you on that. And I want to thank you for including this story and my work, the Lord's work that I'm doing. So thank you for the privilege of talking to you about all of this.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again.